If you're in the doghouse, if you've been in the doghouse, or you think you're going to be in the doghouse, you're going to be in the doghouse at some point. Keep this thing in mind. This is what you do. You build this covered bridge and then you rent the bridges of Madison County. See where I'm going here? You give this to your significant other, watch that movie, you're out of the doghouse, guaranteed. So I absolutely love covered bridges. They're super unique, rare, and built to last, obviously. So while I was doing some research for some smalls, I came across a covered bridge bird feeder for $250, and it didn't look very good. So came up with this. This is a super fun build, and if you are in this to make money with woodworking, you can mark my words, this will be the next big thing. All right, so the very first thing that I'm going to do, have a couple of fence pickets here. I'm going to rip these down to 5 1/4 of an inch, just because, you know, fence pickets, they're not always 5 1/2. Sometimes they're a little heavy, sometimes they're a little light. Most of the time they're light. I'm going to go ahead and rip these down to 5 1/4 just so we're working with the exact same material. And don't forget your PPE. All right, so now that we have a couple boards cut, set over to the miter saw and cut these down to length. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is to make my ends for the bridge. You know, the part with the little arch in it. I'm actually going to cut one end from each end of a board. The reason why I'm doing it this way is because the part itself is only 5 1/4 by 4 1/4, and I need to make two 45-degree cuts on that. So by doing it this way, I'm just going to keep my hands away from the saw. So I'm going to start off by squaring my end. I'm going to measure over to 2 5/8 and make my mark. This will be center. Then I'm going to set my saw to 45 degrees and then use the mark that I just made as my guide. After my first cut, I'll flip my board over, measure over to make sure that we're still at 2 5/8 at center, make my mark, and make my cut. So once I have my 45-degree gable end here, I'm actually going to flip the board completely around, square my end, and then repeat that process one more time. So I'm about to teach you step by step on how to build this super cool, super unique covered bridge bird feeder. But as always, if you are a plans in the hand type of person and you would like to support the channel, head over to my website or my Etsy store. I'll throw a link in the description. So at this point, I have this 45-degree gabled end on both sides. From here, I'm going to measure down 4 1/4 and make my mark. Then I'll repeat this for the opposite end. 4 1/4 from the tip. And once I have that marked, I'll just cut these parts off. So now I'll cut the rest of my parts. Actually, instead of putting those gables both on the same board, if I put one on the end of each one of these boards, probably would have had enough material just in these two boards to get the parts that I'm about to cut. But hindsight's 20/20, and I've already cut the boards. If you do end up getting the plans, I'll have everything lined out for the least amount of waste. Let's go ahead and cut our top boards to length, which is going to be 23 inches. Since these boards will end up overlapping, we'll still need to rip a 1/2 of an inch off the side of one of these, but we'll get to that here in a minute. So once we have our tops cut to size, let's go ahead and cut our sides. So our sides are going to be 5 1/4 by 21 inches long. We'll need 2 of those. And we're also going to need a bottom board. Let's go ahead and cut that at 21 inches as well. So while we're cutting our parts to size here, this is how the roof is going to be. So we're going to have one board that it will be overlapping the other. So in order for these to end up the same size and one not be longer than the other, this bottom board, we need to take a 1/2 of an inch off. So 4 3/4. Let's go ahead and get that cut. Right, so now that I have my base parts cut, we ended with the roof parts here. Let's go ahead and assemble these and get these out of the way. So for this, our 5 1/4 board will actually butt up against our 4 3/4 board. So I'm going to put some wood glue down this edge. Then you can assemble this using a brad nailer or a stapler. If you have a narrow crown stapler, that's going to make this thing a lot sturdier than just using brad nails. But if you don't have a crown stapler, brad nails will work just fine. I've just recently started using a crown stapler for these smaller builds, and so far, I'm really impressed. Let's go ahead and move on to our little end gables. I'm going to measure over 1 inch from each end, then 1 inch from the center. So with these 3 marks, now I have an idea on how my arch needs to flow. All right, so to make this arch, you can really use anything that's round, just as long as it lines up all of your points. Like this is too small. Some more tape here. This is pretty much spot on. Top and both sides meet up. Or if you have a really thin piece of scrap wood, you can bend it and actually use that. And if all else fails, you can always freehand this. If you're not into that kind of thing, I'll make sure to have a printable template in the plans. So now that I have my end gables marked the way that I want them, let's go ahead and cut these out. And for this, I'm just going to be using a jigsaw with a scroll blade on it. These scroll blades are pretty awesome. They allow you to make a really tight radius cut. I'm going to go ahead and hit my top and my gables with a sander, and then I'll be ready to install these gables. On the inside of my roof, I'm going to measure a 1/2 inch in, just make a mark on all 4 corners. This will be an indicator of how far I need to set my gable in. So now with my 1/2 inch marked, I also know where to put my glue. Once I have my glue in, I'm just going to slide my gable into place. Then with everything in place, I'm going to throw in a couple of staples. And then we'll do the same thing for the opposite end. Now for my two 21-inch side walls. Back at the table saw, I'm going to go ahead and set this for 45 degrees. So with our saw set to 45 degrees, we'll set our fence to 4 3/4 and then make our 45-degree cuts. So the reason why we wanted this 45-degree edge on both of our side walls is so that it would actually nest against our roof here, the angle that we needed for our ends to be square with our gable. You'll see where that'll come into play shortly. But if you do not want to make this long 45-degree rib, you don't have to. You could just put it in square if you'd like. But you may have to put in a couple of nails at an angle. The next step for our sides is going to be probably the most detailed because we have to make this piece of wood essentially look like the side of a covered bridge. Instead of cutting a bunch of little parts and trying to glue all of that stuff together, we can do it all as one piece and make it to where it's repeatable pretty quickly. Let me show you how I'm going to lay this out. Okay, so we're going to end up with a lot of different marks on this board. So just to make sure that you can see what I'm doing, I'm going to use a couple of different Sharpies there. So whenever we're making these marks on the board, we're going to put our mitered edge at the top and with the miter showing. The way that this will fit in, this is going to be the side wall. So the first thing that I'm going to do is on each end, I'm going to measure up 2 inches. And I'm also going to make a mark at 3 1/4 on each end. Next, from the end, I'm going to measure over 2 inches. I'm going to make a mark. And from that mark, I'm going to measure up 2 inches. We'll go ahead and just square this off. Then I'll repeat that for the opposite side. Once we have these two little squares on the end, I'm just going to X these out. This material will end up being removed. I'm going to take a straight edge. I'm going to line it up with our 3 1/4 inch mark and the inside corner of this box that we've made. I'm going to trace this out, then draw an X on the inside of that. And then I'll do the same thing for the opposite side. So all these little X's just helps to keep you from getting confused on what you should cut and what you shouldn't. So while we have everything here, let's go ahead and mark out our 1-inch slats. So these 1-inch slats are going to make the board look like it's a bunch of little boards put together. You'll see what I mean. So what I'm going to do with that is just simply make a mark at every 1 inch. I'll use these marks as my cutting reference. And that's what we need for now. So we have matching ends with this material to remove. We have all of our little 1-inch marks. And again, material to remove on the right hand side. With our board all marked up, I'm going to go ahead and remove these 2 end pieces with the jigsaw because these slats that we'll be putting in, they're going to fall right along some of these marks that we've made and then they'll just disappear. So let's go and get that cut. We're going to be removing each corner. So I'm just going to follow my lines. Just like that. You can now kind of start to see how this is all going to work out. So to make these little slats that go all the way across, I'm just going to set my saw to where it will remove about 1/8 of an inch material all the way down this board at every 1-inch increment. Again, this is going to kind of give us that multiple pieces put together look. Now this can be done on your miter saw using a depth stop. If your saw does not have a depth stop, it can also be done with a table saw and a miter gauge. Or if you have a sled for your table saw, it'd make it super easy. You just raise your blade height up to 1/8 of an inch and make these cuts. I'm going to be doing mine on the miter saw. Let me show you how to set that up. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is just take a couple of pieces of scrap wood. This can be 2x4. However, just to build this fence out a little bit, this is going to ensure that we have a straight line instead of at the very end having a circle upcut from the blade. So I've measured down about 1/8 of an inch on the edge of my board. I'm going to use this to set the depth stop. So there's a really good chance of whether you know it or not, your saw has a depth stop. And it's this little tab that's kind of hiding back in the back. It just flips down. So what this little tab does is prevents the saw from going any further than what you set it at. And typically the saw will have like an Allen bolt with a wing nut on it. So to set this depth, I'm going to bring my board to my cut line. Then I'll find the center of my blade or the longest tooth. That's what I want to set to my mark. So I want it set about right there. So with my depth stop down, I'm going to loosen up that wing nut, then just lower this bolt down until it touches the depth stop. Then I'll check it against my line and make any adjustment that I need, up or down, until I've got it exactly where I need it. Once you have it where you need it, tighten up your wing nut. So before I start cutting, I'm going to put the flat edge of the board against my fence extensions. This is going to give me a lot more support than just the tip of this 45. Now I'll just make a cut on each one of my 1-inch marks that will only be 1/8 of an inch deep. The depth stop on a miter saw is one of my favorite little hidden tools that a lot of people really don't even know that they have one. If you're one of those people like I was that did not read the manual whenever you first got your saw, throw me a message in the comments. And anyone that decides to comment, let's keep up with this code word type of thing just to confuse the comment warriors. Let's start off the comment with what manual? And then I'll know who to respond to first. And if you get bored, turn your extra lighting on to disco mode that I didn't even know that it had, and have a party. This looks like police lights. All right, flashbacks, cut. So with that done, you're looking like this. So now we need to mark a couple more sections to jigsaw out. Just to make things easy, I'm just going to call all of these 1-inch sections slats. So next I'm going to go to the 4th slat over, measure 2 inches up from the bottom, and draw a line. Now I'll do this for 3 in a row. Then I'm going to skip this 4th one, and then 3 more. Skip this one, 3 more. Now every one that I'm placing a mark on, we're actually going to be removing the top part of it. So just like that. So then we'll have 3 left at the end. So now all of these that I have my cut line on, I'm just going to put an X up above it. Again, this is just going to help me to keep from getting confused and accidentally cut off something that I want to keep. Now with that marked out, time to hit the jigsaw again. So now with the jigsaw, I have my X's here, have my cut line here. First I'm going to go straight down the edge of the one without the mark on both sides. Okay, so now that I have those 2 parts cut, I need to cut this line. So I'm just going to arch my way over and make that cut. And I'll just repeat that for the rest of my X'd out sections. Alright, so now with this side cut, if you're planning on making more than one of these, I'd lay this out on a piece of cardboard or even a 1/4 of an inch plywood and make a traceable jig. So you can actually make these super fast. And if you don't want to mess with all of the different measurements that I just gave you, I'll include a printable template for this in the plans. But for now, since I already have this, I'm going to use it as a jig for my second side. So I'll just take the piece that I've just cut, make sure that the second side is the same orientation as this, make sure that everything is squared up, then I'll just trace it out. Put my X's on as I go, and you could even mark out your slats if you would like. But as easy as it is just to pull a tape and make your marks, I'm just going to do it this way. So with our sides and top done, you just need a bottom board, which is going to be 4 1/4 inches wide by 17 inches long. Then you're going to need 2 of these little small pieces. And these are 4 1/4 inches wide by 3/4 of an inch. And this bottom board and these 2 sides, when we put it together, they're going to make up our tray. But before I put all of this together and we start working on the roof, I'm going to go ahead and paint mine, because I'm going to leave my shingles natural, and it's a lot easier to do it now. So just an FYI, if you do decide to paint or stain, this top is really not all that important because it's going to be covered up here shortly. So I'm going to go ahead and get these painted up, and then we'll put all this together. So just in case you like the way that mine turned out, let me tell you how I did it. I started off by painting all of my material gray, making sure to get into the little grooves that we cut. Once that was dried, I lightly sanded each piece until I had some natural grain coming through the paint. Then I went back and hit each piece with a color that's similar to burnt red. So while we're waiting for that to dry, let's go ahead and start working on our shingles. And for our shingles, we're going to be needing 2 boards that are 23 inches long, 5 1/4 inches wide. Works out perfect. Okay, so to start off making our shingles, I'm going to mark a 1/4 of an inch on each side and then connect my 2 lines. We're just going to be using this line as a reference. So while I have my ruler here, I'm going to go ahead and mark out every 2 inches and make a mark that crosses the line that I just made. Now keep in mind, we're going to be doing this on each side of each board, but we're only going to have to make these measurements once. Once we get this first one cut, we'll just use it as a template. The last mark that you make will only be 1 inch wide. And this is what it should look like as of now. So each one of these marks at 2 inches are going to be the tip of a triangle. And to get this triangle, I'm just going to line the tip of my ruler up, and I'll just tilt my ruler until the 3/8 mark is on the edge of the board. Once I get that lined up, I'll go ahead and trace the sides of my ruler. This will leave us with a little 45-degree triangle. Or if you have a tool that will set to 45 degrees, you can just make your marks this way. Either way will work just fine. As long as we're lining up our point on our 3/8 line, we're good to go. I'm just going to do this all the way down my board. Now remember, we'll only need to do this on one side. If you're using a tool with a 45-degree angle, it may be easier to mark one side, put your pencil at the tip, then bring the tool to your pencil. For this kind of tedious work, Craig's multi-mark is pretty awesome. So now that we have one side marked with our little TPs or triangles. Go ahead and cut those out. Then I'm going to be cutting these out the same way that I did the other parts. Just jigsaw with a scroll blade. We can't forget our very first 2-inch section. It's going to need half of the same marking as we did before. So with those little pieces knocked out, not only do we have one side of our shingles, and we're also going to cut some lines through this, but we have a template. And again, if you don't want to measure out all these little triangles, I'll make sure to put a template in the plans for this as well. So one side of this board does not have our little TP notches, and that's fine. We actually don't need that. But our second board, we're going to put them on both sides. So now that we have one board that kind of looks like a totem pole and one that kind of looks like a half of the totem pole, let's go ahead and put our slats going all the way across. So what we're eventually going to do is to run these boards through a table saw on edge, splitting them in half, and then we'll run them through flat. We'll actually get 2 shingle boards from each side. But before we do that, let's go ahead and put our grooves in our boards first. And we're going to do one thing different for these than we did for our sides. We're actually going to be putting these little grooves on both sides. So if you're using the depth stop, we're going to change this since we're going to be ripping this board in half, where the blade is only going to be cutting about a 1/16 of an inch deep. If you're using a table saw, just lower the table saw down to a 1/16. For my one-sided board, I'm just going to line my blade up with the tip of my V or my triangles and then make my cut. For the double-sided board, I want to make sure that my 2 tips line up. And there we have it. Not too bad at all. Now this next part, we're going to be splitting the material. If you're not comfortable doing that, then just don't do it. It would just take one more extra board and you could leave it at full thickness if you would like. It's up to you. So to make this cut, I'm going to be cutting each side of this board in half, but not the entire board. So in order to do this, since my material is only 1/2 of an inch thick, I'm going to set my fence to where the blade will be cutting right down the middle. Then I'm going to set my blade height to 2 1/4. So with the thickness of my blade, my fence will be set at about 3/16 of an inch. So for my double-sided board, if I make this cut on both sides, I'm still not cutting all the way through my material. It makes it a lot easier to handle. Okay, so with both of our boards split in half, we're going to turn one board into 4 boards. So now we're just going to lower our blade back down to a little above the thickness of our material. Since we made our interior cut at 2 1/4, that's what I'm going to set the fence for. Now we have something that resembles a shingled roof. So since all of our parts are cut, let's put this thing together. So before I put this together real quick, one last thing that I just now decided to do because I think it would look better is I want to make these shingles kind of stand out a little bit. So I want to darken up the lines that we cut into this. So I'm just going to take this gray spray paint that I used earlier and just kind of hit those lines. I'm going to let this dry, then sand off the top, leaving those dark lines into our little grooves. And if you're wondering how the color of our other boards turned out, this is with the burnt red on top. I'm going to lightly sand this. So now we have a really cool barnwood look. And let me show you what it'll look like with a little bit of finish on it. So we have the undercolors that will pop out. The grain's going to pop because we just sanded the tops of that off. This looks awesome. And I'll do the same thing for the rest of my parts. Okay, so to start putting these together, we're going to start with our shingles and our top piece. I'm going to have my shingles separated into 2 separate sets. That way our lines kind of offset each other. And the same thing on the opposite side. Then we're going to start off with a bottom shingle. I'm going to put some wood glue on the back of this. I'm going to keep the wood glue off about 1/2 of an inch from the edge because I'm going to have a 1/2 of an inch overhang. I'm going to start at the bottom, measure out my overhang. I'm going to lock this into place using 5/8 brad nails. The staples are great from the main frame, but these brad nails will do the trick for the shingles. Now for our second row, we're just going to make sure that it's offset. We'll glue the back. I'm going to mark down 1/2 of an inch on both sides. Then I can just line my second shingle up with my marks. We'll just repeat this for our last one, or you can bring it up right to the edge of your cap. Then we're just going to repeat this process for our second side. And this very last shingle that we put on, we're going to cover the edge of the top shingle on the opposite side. So now we have super cool roof. It's going to look really cool with the finish on it. Let's get the rest of this put together. Now for the rest of these parts, it's just going to be a matter of gluing these things up and putting them into place. So for our sides, put a little bit of wood glue on all of my 45s. Then I'm going to slide this in. It's going to follow right along the outside edge of our end gables. So this lines up great here, and the side itself is resting right on that 45 degrees. This one's ready to be nailed. So for this, I'm going to be using 1-inch brad nails. I'll throw a couple in each end, and I'll lean this thing over so that I can shoot some into my 45s. One wall's up. Now we'll just repeat this for our second one. And during the painting process, if you completely sealed off this 45-degree angle, go ahead and sand some of that off so this glue can actually get into some of those pores. Line it up with our gable ends. Slide it down into place. Make sure that our 45s are sitting flush against the top. So now for our bottom. Let's go ahead and put our end pieces on. That way we can fasten these from the back. Just going to put a little wood glue on the end. And I'm going to put this face down. Bring our bottom to where it is flush with the end. Throw in a couple of brad nails. So this is going to help to hold the bird food in if you use this as a bird feeder. If you're using this as decoration, you really don't even need this part. So one other thing that we're going to have to consider, if this is actually a bird feeder, then it's going to need some way to mount this to a pole. So if you're not using this as a bird feeder, just skip this next step and you can install this in. But if you are planning on using this as a bird feeder, just throw in a couple of mounting brackets on the bottom. All right, so there's a couple of different ways that you can make these mounting brackets. I'm just going to be using a couple of pieces of scrap 2x2. So that's all that I've done with this. It's cut a 45-degree angle on each side, and it's 4 1/4 inches wide. I also went ahead and pre-drilled and countersunk 2 screw holes. So it'll go on the bottom, kind of like this. Then if someone wants to attach this to a 4x4 post, it'll look something like this. Another option, if you do not have any 2x2 scrap laying around, which you should, is you can just laminate together a few pieces of your scrap cut off and make yours this way. Either way, scrap wood will work. So for placement of these blocks, you need to measure 6 3/4 of an inch in from each side. And that's going to leave us with 3 1/2 inches in the center. So since these two brackets are going to be holding quite a bit of weight, I'm going to attach these pretty good. Let's just start with some wood glue on the bottom. I'll put it back on my mark. Same thing. Just to hold these into place, I'm just going to throw a couple brad nails just in the end, just so I can flip this over. So now from the front side, you can actually see where your centers are going to go, and you can mark your centers for screw placement this way, or you can just simply measure over 6 inches from your end and mark your material that way. Either way works. I'm going to measure 1 inch in on each side for both of my brackets. Then at those marks, I'm going to pre-drill 1 inch down. Then I'm going to countersink and then install 4 1-inch screws. So now with that out of the way, now we can actually fasten this to our bridge. So to attach this to our bridge, I'm going to put wood glue all the way around this on both sides. And again, this is exterior wood glue. Now I'm just going to slide this into place. You may have to pull up just a hair on your sides and slide it in. Once we have this slid into place, let's throw in a couple of brad nails from the side. And I'm really only actually putting in a couple because I'm going to put a couple of screws in here as well. Since this is holding the weight of all of this, it needs to be extra strong at the base. But again, this is going to be completely up to you. So I'm going to mark my bottoms at 2, 8 1/2, and 15. I'm going to measure up 1/4 inch and pre-drill. Then we'll put in a little countersink. Then I'm going to install some 1-inch screws. All right, so this is what it turned out like. Check it out. Too cool. It's a mini covered bridge. Now I'm going to put a finish coat on this, maybe just a spray-on spar urethane. It's going to make these colors really pop and protect it a little bit more from the weather. Now I use cedar on this, but honestly, since I ended up painting most of this, you could probably use pine pickets and just maybe use cedar for the tops. You could actually build these really cheap. I can guarantee you these things are going to sell like crazy. So with just a few fence pickets and a little bit of imagination, we have created something super unique and awesome. And whenever you add together super unique and awesome, that equals sales. So if you're in this to make money with woodworking, this is your project. Or if you're just in this for fun, this is also your project. Either way, you're off the couch and you're using your hands and your mind. Till next time, guys, we'll see ya.